Hello, everyone. My name is Franziska Böhnisch,
And I'm Adam Dziedzic.
and we are super excited to present to you our work from our SprintML group at CISPR on the empirical privacy of differential private large language model adaptations. This work is also part of my ERC grant on privacy for foundation models. Imagine we have a hospital that takes a public LLM like Olmo and wants to adapt it to their sensitive patient data. The question that we now have is that if we use differential privacy to do the adaptation, how much of the sensitive information leaks from the predictions of the LLM in practice? And we show that in foundation models, the leakage doesn't only depend on the DP adaptation methods or the privacy guarantee, but also on the whole pre-train adapt pipeline of the models. So let me briefly walk you through this pipeline. Foundation models are first pre-trained on massive and uncurated data, so they become powerful general purpose models. Then they are adapted on more specific downstream tasks, for example, through fine-tuning, low-rank adaptation, or some prompting. And it's been shown that if we include some private information, like private messages, images, or in our case, the private medical record of a patient into the adaptation data, then this information can leak from the final model predictions. And this leakage is severe because it can leak word per word in text or pixel by pixel in images. So our community has been working on designing defenses that can protect the privacy by designing differential private adaptation methods that turn basically the non-private methods into private ones. And with that, these methods ensure that in theory, the data from the adaptation only leaks up to a bound specified by the privacy guarantee epsilon. But what we find now in our work is that in this complex training paradigm, where we have first the pre-training, if we adapt on two very different data sets with the same method, the same guarantee, we still observe a very different leakage in practice. And this can be partially attributed to the fact that the adapted model inherits its initial structure from the pre-training. And that is very different from standard machine learning, where we train the models first from scratch in a single go and on a single data set. So what motivated us really is to understand in a structured way how this change in training paradigm really affects the empirical protection of differential private LLMs adaptation. And therefore we designed our benchmark. For our benchmark, we consider various families and sizes of LLMs and adaptations with data in diverse relationships to the pre-training data. For example, we consider out of distribution data. This means adaptation data, which is very different from the pre-training. For example, if you were to pre-train in English text only, then a German adaptation text would be in ORD data. We also consider IRD data. This is data that is taken from the validation splits of the pre-training data sets. For example, in the pile and the validation splits from the data that we have there. And finally, we take also overlap data. This means data in the adaptation that has already been used in pre-training. For adapting the LLM, then we experiment with diverse state-of-the-art methods, including prefix tuning, which adds a prompt before every layer's input, LoRa, which trains low-rank adapters, full fine-tuning, which updates all the model parameters, and then the head fine-tuning, which only updates the parameters of the last layers. We also do vary the privacy on like epsilon. So we start with very high privacy with an epsilon of 0.1 and then go over various values to an epsilon of infinity, which means basically training without differential privacy. And then finally for auditing, the empirical leakage, we use the state-of-the-art robust membership inference attack, and we also use data extraction attacks. Finally, we also introduce diverse types of canaries into the adaptation data and then measure the exposure of those canaries. And our main question in this setup is, what empirical privacy risk does remain after the DP adaptation?
Let's answer this question. So our first finding highlights that distribution of the data in pre-training adaptations influences the leakage. We find that the closer the adaptation data to the pre-training data, the higher privacy leakage. This is true even when there is no exact overlap between the pre-training data and adaptation data. Here, in this table, we compare models adapted on the OOD data, being articles from the German Wikipedia, IID data from the validation set of the book corpus dataset, and the overlapping data from the book corpus training set. We use all the different adaptation methods. Here we report the AUC score for epsilon equals 8 and for the PIFIA 1 billion model pre-trained on the pile. We run experiments under the same privacy regime and with a similar utility for all adaptations. Let's focus on the AID data with the results bolded in the middle column. The AID data is from the same distribution as pre-training, but not seen during pre-training. What we observe is that the AID data leaks substantially more than the OOD data. What's more, the IID data is as vulnerable as the overlapping data. Thus, the privacy risk is highly influenced by distributional proximity of the data and not only by the theoretical guarantees. This means that in practice, if we adapt a model that was already pre-trained on similar data to our adaptation data, then the practical privacy leakage is higher. Our second result shows that different adaptation methods lead to substantially different leakage, even under the same formal privacy guarantees. Here in this graph, we compare adaptation methods at similar utility and at the same privacy guarantee epsilon. The x-axis denotes the privacy guarantee epsilon for the adaptation, while the y-axis represents the AUC score. The higher the AUC score is also denoting higher leakage. And now for the high epsilon values shown in the red box and non-private settings, LoRa provides much better empirical privacy protection than the other adaptation methods. But the differences become actually a bit more subtle under the higher privacy regimes, meaning lower epsilon values. Here, in this case, LoRa achieves also relatively low AUC. However, other adaptation methods show varying trends depending on the dataset or privacy budget. Next, we also ask the reverse question. How does an adaptation affect back the leakage of memorized pre-training data? This matters because pre-training data can itself be sensitive. It was shown that the models were, for example, pre-trained on emails or private chats. In this graph, the x-axis represents again the epsilon value used for the adaptation, and here the y-axis denotes the number of memorized samples from the pre-training data before the adaptation. Then, under different adaptations and different privacy regimes, we analyze how many of these examples are still extractable. We find that adaptation method influences this extractability. Here, we show in the red box for the prefix tuning that it reduces the number of extractable memorized samples the most for the pre-training set. And this is especially visible for strong privacy settings, so for the low epsilon values. The other methods preserve much more the initial pre-training extractability, and then overall, this shows that privacy should be analyzed over the whole pipeline of pre-training and adaptations for foundation models. And this exactly motivates the final contribution of our work. Namely, we propose a formal framework on how we should audit privacy of foundation models in the future. We consider the following stages. First, auditing the pre-training. We denote the pre-training data as S. This resembles standard ML model audits, where the question is whether a particular data point was or not in the pre-training set S. A practical difficulty here is that the bigger models and the larger datasets, they make this audit signal weaker. Next is the auditing of adaptations. It differs from standard ML audits since the model here is initialized from pre-trained weights and not from the random initialization. As we just showed, this can have side effects on the empirical privacy leakage. Then we propose to jointly audit both stages. In this approach, the question for auditing becomes, was the data point used either in pre-training or in adaptation or in both stages or not at all? And finally, the last stage of audit is post-adaptation. The question is, can we identify whether or not a given data point was in pre-training after the adaptation of the pre-trained model. So we envision this framework as a foundation for holistic privacy audits. Our insights from this work will also guide practitioners who have to adapt models on sensitive data on how to really implement privacy by design. This means selecting the right adaptation methods, pre-trained models, and also the privacy regimes. To summarize, the main lesson from our work is this. For foundation models, the practical privacy is not only a property of the DP training run, but it also highly depends on the entire lifecycle from pre-training to the final adaptation. With that, thank you for your attention.